Is English more Germanic than German? It's a bold proposition, perhaps even an outrageous one at first glance, that English, that globally hybridized, grammatically eroded, Latin-flooded language of Shakespeare, science, and Silicon Valley, might somehow be more Germanic than German. But hear me out. We're not talking about case endings, grammatical gender, or modal particles here. Not yet. We're talking about roots, influences, and the messy migratory story of a language that wandered far from home, yet never quite forgot where it came from. A family tree with more branches. Let's begin with ancestry. Modern German, or Hochdeutsch, descends into a cleanish line from West Germanic roots, specifically from the High German dialects of Old High German and Middle High German. From the Alps to Luther's printing press, the lineage is traceable, relatively contained, and shaped mostly by internal variation within the German-speaking world. English, by contrast, is the linguistic equivalent of a cosmopolitan cousin, related to the same ancestors, but far, far more colourful. It began, like German, in the West Germanic branch, with the Anglo-Saxon invasions bringing a stew of Old Saxon, Anglian, and Jutish dialects to the shores of Britain. This was the Old English of Beowulf, raw and earthy, full of compound words and inflectional endings. But that's just the beginning. Then came the North. In the 9th century, Norse-speaking Vikings arrived and stayed. Rather than simply pillaging and leaving, they settled in parts of England, bringing with them Old Norse, a North Germanic language that turned out to be so similar to Old English that mutual understanding was often possible. But here's the twist. The Norse impact on English was deeper and more lasting than is often acknowledged. They didn't just contribute vocabulary, sky, egg, window, they, them, their. They reshaped English grammar. They reinforced the erosion of inflection, simplified syntax, and may have helped catalyze the move toward fixed word order and prepositions. In some ways, modern English grammar is as much Norse-shaped as Anglo-Saxon. German, in contrast, never had this kind of North Germanic encounter. Its structure remained more insular, with internal dialectal shifts, but relatively little from outside the West Germanic sphere. The sound of the North. Norse didn't just bring they, them, and their. They brought sounds, and those sounds linger, especially in the pronunciation divide between the north and south of England. In areas where Viking settlers stayed, particularly Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, Cumbria, and parts of the East Midlands, the Old Norse phonetic impact, or imprint, can still be heard today. This is not just a matter of vocabulary, but how things are said. One of the clearest examples is the sk-sh distinction. Old English, under West Germanic influence, tended to soften sk sounds into sh, but Norse kept them hard. Old English, skip, it's ship. Old Norse, skip, and the dialects retain skip in various forms. That's why in northern dialects you'll hear skell, to laugh, skite, to slip or fall, or skitter, to move quickly. All from Norse, and preserving that sharp sk onset. Another shift is the flattened vowels and monophthongs typical of northern speech. Compare the southern English word goat or face with the more narrow monophthongal vowels in the north, goat, face. This too aligns more closely with Scandinavian vowel system than their southern English counterparts, a subtle but deep-rooted phonological echo. And in pronouns and auxiliary verbs, have, thee, thou, hast, we hear not just archaic forms but blended ones. Some are Old English holdouts, others are Norse survivals. Most are hybrids. In some northern dialects, I becomes a, which aligns not only with phonological reduction, but with vowel systems in Norse and Scots, which is also Norse influenced. So what we see isn't just grammar bending under Viking pressure, it's phonology shifting to accommodate a second Germanic system. The resulting dialectal split between the north and south of England is still alive today, centuries after the Danelaw was signed. The Hanseatic whisper. When the Vikings left a visible trail, other Germanic influence on English came more subtly, through trade. During the Middle Ages, the Hanseatic League linked England to powerful merchants of northern Germany and the Low Countries. Through this, Middle Low German left traces in shipping, law and commerce, skipper, freight, dock, hustings. And of course, we can't forget the Dutch. Words like cookie, boss, yacht, and coleslaw may feel like footnotes in the English lexicon, but they underscore another point. English has had meaningful contact with nearly every major Germanic language, West, North, and Low, across its evolution. German, in contrast, remained firmly rooted in its own dialectal soil. Low German and High German did war and wobble over prestige, but the overall story is a single branch continuity, not a web of cross-Germanic contact. But then the French arrive, and this is where the Romanticism stumbles. Because right after the Norse influence, in comes the Norman conquest, and with it French, Latin, in a new outfit. Suddenly, English is flooded with vocabulary from law, government, art, and cuisine. By the time Chaucer puts pen to parchment, England has absorbed thousands of Romance words and begun its transformation into the peculiar hybrid we know today. But wait, even the French weren't entirely non-Germanic. Just when we're ready to concede that the Norman conquest drowned English in Romance vocabulary, a quiet reminder surfaces. Norman French wasn't entirely Romance either. The word Norman itself comes from Nortman, Northman, a term used for the Scandinavian settlers who took over northern France in the 9th and 10th centuries. These Vikings didn't just plunder, they stayed, settled, and ultimately blended with the Gallo-Romance speakers in the region that became Normandy. While they gradually adopted a Romance tongue, the Norsemen left their linguistic fingerprints in vocabulary, naming conventions, and even aspects of legal and military terminology. The Duke, who conquered England in 1066, was William the Bastard, but history remembers him as William the Conqueror, a Norman, yes, but a descendant of Norsemen. Thus, when Norman French flooded into English after 1066, it brought with it not just Latinized prestige, but Norse-coloured Romance, a creolized dialect that had already passed through a German filter. And that's not all. The Frankish language, spoken by the Franks, another West Germanic people, had also left a deep impact on the evolution of French. By the time French began to crystallize as a Romance language, it had borrowed hundreds of Frankish words, especially in areas related to warfare. Guerre comes from Frankish wera, government, maréchal, pam, baron, daily life, blanc, jardin, tasse. So when English absorbed Norman French, it wasn't just importing Latin via a Romance vessel, it was also indirectly importing Frankish Germanic elements that had become embedded in early French. In other words, even the French invasion had residual German notes hidden within its Latin symphony. So where does this leave us? Well, we began with a sort of provocative question. Is English more Germanic than German? The surface answer seemed obvious. No, German preserves its cases, its inflections, its proud and tangled compound nouns. English, meanwhile, shed its endings, took in Latin by the bucket load, and seemed at first glance to have drifted far, from the Germanic homeland. But dig beneath the surface and the story becomes complicated. English is not the prodigal child of a single dialect group. It's the result of layer upon layer of Germanic contact. West Germanic, which is Old English's core. North Germanic, Norse's deep restructuring of syntax, lexis, and pronunciation. Middle Low German via trade and seafaring. Dutch and Modern German through immigration, commerce and scholarship. Even Norse, French, and Frankish. Norman French too, once thought to be Holy Romance, carried echoes of Norse and West Germanic tongues that had been digested and recycled into new forms. Few languages have such a web of Germanic intertwining stretching across branches, borders, and centuries. Yet, modern English lacks many of the grammatical hallmarks of its German cousins. Yes, German remains more structurally faithful to its ancestral patterns, but in terms of contact, influence, and the number of Germanic sources coursing through its bloodstream, English stands almost alone. But it's not the most Germanic language by form, but perhaps, just perhaps, it's the most Germanic by entanglement. A polyglot within the family, carrying fragments of nearly every sibling. A mongrel, not a purebred, but a mongrel with the whole pack's DNA. Let's take a look further at Latin. So what the Romans really didn't do for us? The curious absence of Latin in early English. So when the Anglo-Saxons first arrived on the shores of Britain in the 5th century, they weren't stepping into an unclaimed wilderness. They were stepping into what had, for nearly 400 years, been Roman Britannia, a land of roads, towns, villas, and Latin-speaking officials. And yet, remarkably, when we look at Old English, there's barely a whisper of Latin influence from this Roman period. So what happened? The Latin that vanished. You might expect English to be soaked in Latin from the start, but early Old English has almost no native Latin vocabulary apart from a few ecclesiastical terms introduced later by Christian missionaries, monk, minister, mass, etc. The reasons are striking and a little sobering. Rome packed up and left. By around 410 AD, the Roman troops had been recalled to the continent. Whatever central government or elite Latin-speaking class remained quickly withered. The newcomers weren't interested in Roman continuity. The Anglo-Saxons and Jutes didn't see themselves as inheritors of Roman Britain. They didn't try to preserve its culture. They replaced it. And crucially, Latin never became the language of the masses in Roman Britain. It was mostly the language of administration, the army, and educated elites. When the infrastructure collapsed, Brythonic Celtic, the everyday tongue of the native population, reasserted itself. The Brythonic thread. This brings us to a subtler but more fascinating influence. The Celtic language is spoken by Britons before, during, and after the Roman occupation. Although early English has shockingly few obvious Celtic borrowings, many linguists now believe that the Brythonic, well, it left its mark, not in vocabulary, but in grammar. It's a linguistic ghost story, invisible on the surface, but deeply embedded. Here are a few examples. The periphrastic do. Do you know him? I don't like it. This quirky construction is almost unique to English among Germanic languages, but strikingly parallel structures in Welsh. The progressive aspect, she's singing, they were going, I'll be working. Again, this form is overused by English compared to its Germanic cousins, but it's standard in modern Welsh. Celtic names. These place names crop up everywhere, from Avon, meaning river, to Pen, hill, Bryn, hill, and even London, Devon, and Kent. The land remembers even when the language forgets. This suggests that when the Anglo-Saxons took over, they didn't exterminate the native Britons, they ruled them, they lived beside them, possibly enslaved some, married others, and perhaps more significantly, absorbed just enough of their linguistic patterns to shift the shape of English forever. So although Latin fell away, largely because it had never sunk deep roots, Brythonic survived in the shadows, influencing the syntax and rhythm of English long after the last native speaker in the Midlands forgot how to speak it. That doesn't mean English is a Celtic language in disguise, but it does mean it's not a pure Germanic transplant either. It's a blend, messy, layered, evolving organism, shaped not by just those who conquered the land, but by those who stayed on it. In other words, even in the earliest days of English, the language was already a palimpsest. Roman roads beneath Saxon fields, Celtic syntax beneath German speech. Now, when we talk about Germanic languages, most minds leap to German. The clue is in the name. Maybe Dutch or perhaps Icelandic if they're feeling adventurous. English gets an honourable mention, albeit with a caveat that's a bit of a mongrel, but Scots? Most folks still think of this as an English dialect with a strong accent and some quirky spellings. Time to set the record straight. It's more than just Burns Night banter. Scots isn't a dialect, it's a language. A bona fide Germanic language with a lineage going all the way back to Northumbrian Old English, one of the most conservative and least Latinized branches of Anglo-Saxon. This makes Scots a sort of linguistic time capsule, an offshoot that diverged from English and grew up on its own north of the border. While English was getting cozied up to French, soaking up Latinisms and polishing its vowels for courtly use, Scots was doing something else entirely. It was trading with the Low Countries, soaking up words from Dutch and Low German, words like kirk, scone, loon, sindri, rubbing shoulders and sometimes swords with Old Norse influences from the Viking heavy north and Isles, retaining heaps of Old English vocabulary long after English dropped it in favour of French or Latin alternatives. In short, Scots was busy doubling down on its Germanic identity, while English was off having a continental makeover. Word for word, it's Germanic to the core. Have a wee look at some typical Scots vocabulary. Ken, to know, Old English, kennen. Bairn, child, Old Norse, barn. About. Gang, go. Greet, cry. Licht, light. Muckle, big. All firmly Germanic in root and feel. It's not just words. The rhythm, sound and stress patterns of Scots, especially in older forms, have a distinctly Germanic lilt. If you listen to someone from Aberdeenshire or the Borders reading Robert Burns aloud, you'd be forgiven for thinking that you were hearing a blend of Shakespearean English and Low Saxon with a side of Viking. Now, let's be honest, Scots isn't the most structurally Germanic language in the world, not compared to, say, Icelandic, which still clings to cases, genders, and complex verb endings like a dragon hoarding treasure. But in terms of vocabulary, sound, cultural and historical influences, and a general resistance to Romance language dilution, Scots might just take the crown for most Germanic vibe in the modern linguistic lineup. But here's the twist. Scots isn't some dusty linguistic relic. It's still spoken fluently, passionately across Scotland today. It's still changing, still borrowing, still finding its place in schools, poetry, comedy, and online banter. So next time someone tells you that English is the Germanic success story, give a respectful nod to its northern cousin, because Scots has been flying the Germanic flag boldly, stubbornly, and without a French dictionary in sight for centuries.